You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C., as usual.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, and I am back in Maryland.
Good to be back with you, Katie. I know we've taken a bit of an extended break, but it is August, and I hope August is treating our listeners well, but it's good to be back with you.
Yeah, it's always great to talk to you, Ankit.
Yeah, and of course, while much of the world is hopefully enjoying a slow summer, geopolitics in Asia certainly is far from slowing down. Of course, we've had, I've actually received many Twitter DMs and a couple emails from our listeners asking for an episode discussing recent events in the Taiwan Strait. I'm not going to take a particular position on whether or not we should be calling what happened in the first couple weeks of August 2022 the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis. Perhaps we can talk about that a bit, Katie. But of course, it's been an exciting month in the Taiwan Strait. Exciting in the sense of eventfulness, not in terms of positive or negative developments per se. So for listeners, of course, what we're talking about is the visit by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, to Taiwan. Her visit, of course, wasn't unprecedented. A similar visit took place 25 years ago in the 1990s, but Pelosi did become the most senior member of the U.S. government and the senior most member of the legislative branch in particular to visit Taiwan. And that, of course, led to a set of unprecedented reactions from China, including missile launches over Taiwan, joint People's Liberation Army exercises in 7 areas surrounding Taiwan, including for the first time within Taiwan's territorial seas, a huge set of incursions by Chinese military aircraft across the median line of the Taiwan Strait, the introduction of certain new capabilities like drones over Taiwan's outer islands of Kinmen and Matsu, and so on and so forth. We can maybe go into a little bit more detail on the military dimensions itself. But Katie, I think the place to start, and maybe you can tee us off a bit here, is sort of the American position leading up to the visit itself. The Biden administration, of course, made the point that the United States has a system of government with 3 co-equal branches: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And the president of the United States, as the head of the executive branch, can't necessarily tell Nancy Pelosi what she should or should not do. And of course, the White House ultimately came out and said that she has every right to go. But tell us a little bit about the U.S. position on this whole thing. I think that might be a useful basis to start, and then we can talk a bit about the Chinese reaction.
Yeah, sure. So, I think it's important to point out that this visit was originally scheduled for the spring, but then Pelosi came down with COVID. It got canceled, got pushed back. So the fact that it happened is something that arguably for months people knew was a possibility. Certainly in the last couple of weeks leading up to the actual visit, there was a lot more talk and a lot more attention. Will she go? Will she avoid going? And then I think it's important also to note that the Biden administration apparently tried to subtly wave Pelosi off, say it's not really a good time to do this, but then pretty quickly after that came out with I would say fairly strong statement saying, as you noted, Pelosi has every right to make this visit. It's not unprecedented. This is perfectly within how the United States defines its one China policy, and so in the act of doing this visit, Pelosi goes to Taiwan. There's a lot of reporting around that. And we can definitely get into sort of the Chinese reactions and the Chinese rhetoric surrounding that. But on the U.S. side, all of the diplomats that I've spoken to or heard from sort of stress that this is consistent with U.S. policy, long-term U.S. policy. Nothing has changed regarding the U.S. position on Taiwan. Which is not how I think the Chinese frame what's happening. And so, it's one thing to say the United States is provoking a crisis. That's sort of what the Chinese language has been. But from the U.S. side, they're saying this is perfectly normal diplomatic visit. It's a legislative visit. The president of the United States can't tell her not to go, didn't tell her to go. And so then pointed to the Chinese reaction as an overreaction. So Kirk Campbell last Friday on a call with reporters pointed out or stressed really that Chinese actions, quote, were fundamentally at odds with the goal of peace and stability, and made the case that, again, the U.S. is consistent in its policy toward Taiwan, and China is the one that is changing the status quo.
hmm And so, um, you know, what's interesting, of course, is the broader context under the Biden administration, which is that President Biden himself has made a number of statements that have arguably muddled the U.S. position on Taiwan. Biden has explicitly said that he believes that there is a commitment by the United States to come to Taiwan's aid, which, of course, has muddled the broader messaging by the administration around the fact that nothing has changed in American policy towards Taiwan. And so, a bit of background, you had the three communiques between the United States and the People's Republic of China in 1979. After the second communique, the United States formally ended its diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, adopted the One China policy, distinct from China's One China principle. And so, like every country around the world, there's no country that has diplomatic relations with both Taiwan and the PRC. So when the U.S. chose to establish relations with the PRC, Congress took the lead, passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which Biden incidentally voted for at the time in the Senate, which primarily governs the United States' relationship with Taiwan, including providing Taiwan the defense capabilities it needs to defend itself. And so the basis of U.S. Taiwan policy since then, which the Biden administration reemphasizes, is the Taiwan Relations Act, the three communiques as the basis for U.S.-China diplomatic normalization, in 72, 79, and 82, and the six assurances made by the Reagan administration on Taiwan. And the administration has also repeatedly said that it does not support Taiwan independence. All of this leads to a phrase that you hear a lot in discussions on Taiwan policy, which is that the United States favors the preservation of the status quo in the Taiwan Strait.
Yes.
And what's interesting about the phrase status quo is that, arguably there isn't a single status quo in the Taiwan Strait over the last 40 years, right? Things have changed. Things are changing domestically within Taiwan. Just recently, there's public opinion surveys from within Taiwan showing that the number of Taiwanese, particularly young Taiwanese that identify as Chinese, is down to single-digit percentages. The growth of a Taiwan identity is a sort of an inexorable force, Taiwanization. And the other context here is that since the election of Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party in 2016, China has slowly but gradually been tightening its grip around Taipei, restricting the international space for maneuver that Taiwan has, plucking away Taiwan's diplomatic allies, the countries that maintain normalized diplomatic ties with Taiwan, leaving Taipei with, I believe, just 16 countries, including the Vatican, that maintain official ties, and cracking down in a whole number of ways. So the status quo is changing over time. And I think, Katie, that's probably, the next thing we should talk about, which is, what do the events of August 2022 potentially mean going forward for Taiwan's security, for the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which is not something that is a foregone conclusion necessarily. China still favors a peaceful reunification strategy by all accounts, but Xi Jinping has been very open about the fact that China will never rule out the use of force to take Taiwan if Taiwan crosses certain red lines, such as declaring independence, which Tsai Ing-wen is not going to do, but potentially in the future, given the trend lines in Taiwanese politics, that could be something that becomes more realistic. This notion of where the status quo is going to go in the Taiwan Strait, I actually think is probably the most important question about the events of early 2022. I talked a little bit at the beginning about the unprecedented military actions that China took around Taiwan, including the launch of ballistic missiles, unprecedentedly large joint PLA exercises. The concern, I think, in Taipei, or at least certain parts of Taipei, including among security analysts, is that now that we have seen this play out, going forward, the kinds of military activities that China will regularly undertake around Taiwan will probably be more aggressive in general. In the past, the median line in the Taiwan Strait, Taiwan's air defense identification zone, although certainly not treated as sacrosanct by the PLA, were certainly seen as important thresholds to only be crossed somewhat rarely in peacetime. And when I say somewhat rarely, the trend line here, I think, has been decisively negative, right? And I think, the folks who supported Pelosi's trip sort of point this out, which is that even if Pelosi hadn't gone, at some point, something or the other would have broken would have been the last straw on the camel's back, and the PLA probably would have expanded the scope of its activities around Taiwan. So, Katie, I understand, you've been sort of in contact with a few folks, who have sort of communicated the Taiwanese position. What do you think the Taiwanese view here is on the status quo issue? And how do you sort of make sense of how the status quo might be changing?
Yeah, so I before I do that, I do want to say you made a very good point with regard to what is the status quo anyway. I think we sort of use the word to mean sort of that this is a situation that has remained stable. And as you pointed out, things have changed over the last 40 years. So what status quo and whose status quo? From I think the Taiwanese perspective, China has thrown out the status quo in crossing the median line, and sort of this is a violation of Taiwanese space in an unprecedented way from Taipei's perspective, and that if China does this, what more might they do? And I think there's also kind of an unstated concern that if you have more aggressive military measures around Taiwan, I think the risk of an accident escalates, of course, and I think that's something that I think people should be concerned about. And I think the other thing to point out is from the Taiwanese perspective, the question is, well, if this is China readjusting the status quo, are Taiwan's partners around the world just going to let that happen? Does China get to move what is the new normal and define that? And then to go back to the earlier discussion with regard to sort of U.S. policy and sort of U.S. policymakers stressing we've been consistent, and you very rightfully pointing out that there is inconsistency. I think it's worth mentioning that the U.S. position on the Taiwan question, in my opinion at least, is muddled anyway. Like the position itself is ambiguous, and it's specifically ambiguous, and so that creates this kind of weird fluid space where is the U.S. going to come to Taiwan's defense? Is the U.S. not going to come to Taiwan's defense? And that ambiguity is actually the policy, and so that kind of allows this space where you have Biden saying sort of Biden-esque comments occasionally, and then sort of diplomats walking it back and saying that's not really what he meant. It's by design almost. And so I think that creates a degree of concern in Taiwan because it's also ambiguous to them what the U.S. response to something like this is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big debate right now in D.C. Should the U.S. adopt strategic clarity towards Taiwan? I personally don't think that's a wise move. But on the note of ambiguity, I think you're right that there has been some muddling of the message. But I actually think that strategic ambiguity, you can have sort of clarity about your ambiguity, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sort of like
and I'm not saying that it's a bad policy per se, but the confusion is kind of part of the design.
Yeah, so we have sort of, I guess what leaves me a little bit uncomfortable is sort of the ambiguity about our ambiguity. The whole sort of Biden making his statements, officials sort of walking it back and saying, here's what we say, here's our talking points on Taiwan. To be fair, Taiwan policy is actually one of the hardest things, I think, for a lot of folks to wrap their heads around, right? There are, all of these nuances around the 3 communiques, the 6 assurances, the Taiwan Relations Act, where U.S. commitments begin and end to Taipei, what the nature of the U.S. commitment to sell arms to Taiwan is, and so on and so forth. That, I think, presents a fairly complex, set of issues to sort of properly communicate that. So given the salience of the Taiwan Strait in broader Indo-Pacific geopolitics now, it's something that just keeps on coming up. Right, it's a lot more salient in the U.S.-China relationship. Going back for a second to the Chinese response, I do also want to sort of point out that when we sort of debate the notion of whether or not this was a crisis or not, look, we've had 3 Taiwan Strait crises, 2 in the 1950s and 1 in the 1990s and the mid-90s. What China did in August 2022, just a couple weeks ago, militarily, given the dramatic rise in Chinese national power and capabilities, eclipses what China did in any of the previous crises. But the reason why I think, you might be able to make the case that what actually happened in August 2022 wasn't necessarily a crisis was due to the reaction of the United States and Taiwan. The U.S., as you noted, Katie, sort of pointed out that what China is doing is not conducive to maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And the Taiwanese themselves sort of, said that, they're going to resolutely protect their interests, but they didn't do anything to escalate the situation themselves. So it might take, it takes two to tango in a crisis sometimes. And so China sort of, to use the phrase, they sort of threw a temper tantrum about Pelosi's visit. And the U.S. and Taiwan sort of reacted as, the adults in the room, so to speak. And while that was good and de-escalatory, I think the concern that at least I have, and I think it's too early to really say, whether this concern is well placed or not. I think only time will tell. The concern is that by the U.S. and Taiwan sort of playing this cool, we avoided escalation, which could have been dangerous. But we also, I think, failed to communicate to China that, this type of activity, this type of military signaling, really has any costs, right? So that again, goes into the question of changing the status quo. So I'm not sure what the right, I do think what the Biden administration and the Taiwanese did here was totally defensible. There was no reason to escalate. In fact, I think, neither side's interests would have been served by escalating. But the concern is then that, when something happens in Taiwan or some member of the DPP makes a statement that Beijing finds unacceptable, these kinds of transgressions across the median line or missile launches more rarely, could be more regularized. And that, of course, is damaging to Taiwan's interests, damaging to U.S. interests. The other thing I think is important to appreciate is that, China also didn't cross some important thresholds, right? I talked a bit about how they announced exclusion zones within Taiwan's territorial sea, but no Chinese warships entered Taiwan's territorial sea, which would have been like a very clear step to sort of indicate that, China does not consider Taiwan to be sovereign. Similarly, Chinese aircraft did not overfly Taiwanese airspace. The ballistic missiles that overflew Taiwan, of course, were outside the Earth's atmosphere, which an anonymous Taiwanese official actually pointed out to the New York Times, which I thought was pretty interesting given the Japanese reaction, right? We haven't mentioned this, but of course, 5 ballistic missiles landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone, which Tokyo sort of, really was up in arms about. But the Taiwanese really played things cool. And so it's interesting that China sort of, I think also calibrated its actions, recognizing the risk of escalation. And here I think, we might talk about the political context. Biden and Xi just had a meeting before Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. Xi Jinping is going into the 20th Party Congress later this year, looking for an unprecedented third term as General Secretary of the CCP and President of China. And so the role of all this signaling, I think, is partly external, partly to the United States and Taiwan, but also internally to members of the Communist Party, to the Chinese people. And so these events, I think, deserve to be seen through that holistic lens.
So on the topic of escalation, I think that that's a very smart thing to point out, that the United States and Taiwan clearly made a choice to not try to escalate it. But as you also pointed out, the question is then what is the response? And if this happens again, China sort of engages in these kind of provocative measures, how far does China have to go to get a response from Taiwan and the United States? And I think on the other hand, it was a smart calculation, because I think any kind of even subtly escalatory response to this non-crisis, would have inflamed China even more and sort of opened the door to further escalation. I think that's something everybody wants to avoid. And, I think from the U.S. perspective, they know that they're stuck with Xi. So that I think they're trying to figure out how to navigate the future without making it worse.
Yeah, I'll be very open here. I didn't think that Pelosi's visit was necessarily a great idea. I do recognize that there were benefits, showing that Congress continues to stand by Taiwan and that Taiwan has partners, but the costs to Taiwanese national security and to U.S. interests, in my opinion, outweighed those benefits. But, taking that into account, I think basically the way in which this has resolved itself, I think, is far from the worst for China and the United States. I do think, however, it's not necessarily the best set of outcomes for Taiwan. And I think, of course, the acute phase of this crisis, whether or not you call it a crisis again, I don't have a particular position on, but let's just call it a crisis. I think the acute phase is over, although China is still conducting exercises given the next, senatorial delegation that has just arrived in Taipei. But the broader punishments on Taipei, I think, are going to continue, right? There's going to be sanctions, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks on Taiwan, all of which China has carried out and has been carrying out. That's going to continue increasing in tempo. The other thing, that you pointed out, Katie, is that the Biden administration, I think, is genuinely trying to increase the scope of the U.S.-China relationship along a number of axes, right? Basically, they want to cooperate with China where necessary while competing. And so China's response to the United States after this crisis, the sort of 8 measures that Beijing announced, including the cancellation of maritime security dialogues and criminal justice cooperation talks and climate talks, really shows that Beijing sort of interprets these as pressure points. I think the view in Beijing is that the U.S. wants these more than China does. And of course, what was left out on the list of talks that China called off were trade talks, which I think China cares about a little bit more than the U.S. might at this point. And so that, I think, points to, a negative trend line, at least in the short term. But reportedly, Biden and Xi are going to meet in person later this year in Asia.
Yes. So on the call with Campbell last Friday, from where we are sitting now in time, one of the other journalists asked if that meeting was still going to happen, and all he would say is that they're still talking about it. So at least from the U.S. perspective, they're hoping that there will be a Biden-Xi meeting. I think there's definitely some strategy to saying we want a meeting, because then if the meeting doesn't materialize, it's very easy to kind of blame it on the Chinese, as they're the reason it fell through. So I think that was a little bit of strategery, but I think there's certainly an interest in that. In that call, another thing that he mentioned was that the Chinese response targeted things that the world cares about. So the climate change talks, for example, he said, it doesn't really damage the United States to stop talking about those things, but it does damage the world, which is, again, sort of positioning China as this irresponsible actor, and look at the United States for being responsible about this. So there's definitely some playing to the external audience that I think is worth remarking on.
Right. And, I always, in discussions particularly about the internal Chinese dynamics, I think it's always worth noting that, there are significant unknowns about the political dynamics at the highest levels of the CCP. People largely speculate about, why she had to react in this way ahead of the 20th Party Congress. There is an inductive logic to it, which is that she is going into this important party Congress and needs to show that he's sort of strong and avoid any sort of criticism from inside. But really, we don't have a good evidentiary basis for, where she is sort of facing potential challengers, or whether challengers even exist, or whether, this is simply something that's an emotive matter for him, which I think certain analysts of China have made the case that she personally, regardless of the power consolidation considerations, regardless of the 20th Party Congress, for she personally, the Taiwan issue is an emotionally salient issue, and he sort of sees the United States as fundamentally, pushing back on China. So, I think, regardless of not whether you consider this a crisis, I think there will be more bumps in the road in the Taiwan Strait in the coming years, and I think they'll largely be due to China's uncompromising position. China also just released a white paper on Taiwan. Really, this is an absolute priority for the Chinese Communist Party leadership. And so as the U.S. tries to communicate its continuing support for Taipei and tries to actually multilateralize support for Taiwan and for maintaining the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, I think this is far from the last crisis we'll see.
I would agree with that.
All right, Katie, I think we'll leave it there for today. Sorry to listeners for the extended break between the last episode and this one. Hope to be back a little bit sooner with another episode in August. Certainly no shortage of issues to talk about. We may go back to the Korean Peninsula, since we are about to see some U.S.-Korea field training exercises, which haven't happened since 2017, and North Korea may have a response to that. But of course, lots going on around the region, and we'll be back to talk about it all. So, Katie, thanks for joining me as always.
It's always a pleasure.
Great. For listeners, if you like what you heard on the show, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, please leave us a review wherever you get your shows. We really appreciate that. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.